Hello, Year 12. This is just part two of our introduction to Woyzeck lesson. Obviously, where we finished off on the last clip was kind of talking about the fact that Rushna with Woyzeck has kind of revolutionized theatre in a sense because he's putting real people on stage. He knows his audience is middle class. He knows what they're actually expecting on stage, but doesn't give them that. He's decided instead to use it as a platform to educate. And he does this by kind of, he goes against the conventions of theatre of the time. He uses a working class protagonist as the tragic figure who undergoes this downfall. Normally in tragedy before that, it is someone of an elevated position in society who takes that tragic downfall. Here we have a working class tragedy. Normally working class provided comic relief on stage and that was it, but now he's given them more power in a sense, by doing this, which is what he wants. He wants to give them a voice. He knows who's watching and he knows what they expect, and he's not going to give that to them. Okay, he wants to educate, he wants to change things. And in his mind, to start to try and change things, he's changing theatre. That's essentially what happens there. So what you also need to know, for when you write in your responses, for when you write in your production concept and your ideas down, you need to also compare it and discuss what the original performance conditions were like. So the first time Woyzeck was performed on the stage, it was not when Bushner was alive. Remember, he died before you got to finish it, so the final product was not finished. So that would be problematic in terms of putting that on stage. Nevertheless, it was performed on stage. So we've got the next slide here, original performance conditions. And this is in 1913 in the Residence Theatre, okay? It was a proscenium arch stage, which essentially means, and there's a picture of it on your right-hand side here, it's a stage layout which is very, very popular in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. I mean, even now, you'll see a lot of these kind of stages. It's basically where you've got your audience facing straight on, okay? And you've got the stage in front, but the audience and the stage are kind of divided in the middle by this arch, okay? So it's kind of like a window frame into it. So you don't become part of the play, the audience necessarily. You're very much spectators watching something. And it's what we call uses the fourth wall. So it's kind of like, imagine the way they perform it on stage is that there is actually a wall where that arch is, that there's no one actually watching. So there's no audience interaction, so to speak. The audience are arranged in tiers. They would have been, and the audience would have been largely middle class, of course. Basic lighting and colour filters. Essentially, the play itself, with it being unfinished, was very disjointed and episodic. And this would have posed a problem at the time because at the time, art was influenced by a movement called Naturalism, which meant in terms of artwork, performances, literature, they were all influenced by this idea of representing kind of reality, it being realistic. So on stage, realistic performance, realistic and detailed sets, etc. Linear narrative that is easy to follow. However, because this was an unfinished play, it is very disjointed. It's a fractured narrative. That's where our issues lay. Where, of course, an audience of time would have been expecting a linear narrative, they're getting fractured narrative. Yes, this may, encourage maybe, not a very warm reception to the play, but at the same time, what Bushner wanted, he wanted to educate them. He wanted to make them think. And each kind of scene in the play, although it tells a story, is kind of a story, a standalone story in itself, that kind of, each scene highlights all these key themes and ideas. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a linear narrative. And we'll come on to that later on in the lessons as well. So looking more at the idea of naturalism and expressionism. These are two movements that we're going to hope to become very familiar with over the next few weeks. So as I said before, we'll start with naturalism. I'll just get this up. So naturalism was a movement that was sort of about in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it did influence, as I say, art, theatre, and literature. It's where just, in all of these kind of in all of this kind of artwork, they needed to replicate reality and create something believable performances, detailed sets. They weren't really interested in poetic literary styles, the likes of kind of Shakespeare way. It's not very naturalistic. It doesn't reflect real life. It's not how people actually talk now. So realistic dialogue as well as acting, and also aesthetically pleasing. So they wanted a nice detail set, which was like, which was pretty on the eye, which was attractive as well. So this was all part of naturalism, and this, of course, was when we had Woyzeck originally performed. So you can imagine, it went against a lot of the sort of naturalistic ideals. Now, our practitioner that we're going to be looking at, Brecht, he kind of was of the idea that he was against naturalism as such. That wasn't his style. He said you need to break the illusion of reality and encourage a detached consideration of issues. So making it seem replicate real life. He says no, we've become too immersed in it, essentially, and emotionally immersed in it as well. He wanted the audience to be detached. And if you've done your research on Brecht, this will sound familiar to you. If not, don't worry, we're going to come across this and talk about this next lesson. But, he wanted to educate, much like Büchner. He wanted to educate his audience and thought the way to do that is to detach them from what's on stage. Okay, so that was his idea there. So moving on then to German Expressionism. And this is the last slide for this lesson, guys. Okay. German Expressionism was a movement in the 20th century. It didn't last very long, but what it kind of highlighted and what it wanted to where it got its influence from was this idea of distorting reality. So kind of totally against naturalism, the naturalistic style there. Instead, no, we don't want a sort of realism there. We want to be expressive. We want to take that emotion and express it in so many kind of abstract ways to really get the audience thinking. It's to dramatize the sufferings and the emotions of the protagonists, such as Woyzeck. And also it was very much a dramatized against middle class values and authority. This was a kind of rebellious movement in a sense. It was less concerned with aesthetically pleasing composition and more focused on getting a powerful reaction. You wanted to shock the audience. That was the way, and that was the way to educate, much like what Büchner wanted to do. And it was very much about the relationship between art and society. It had a very kind of very real purpose in that sense, in terms of educating and giving voice to not just the middle class anymore, but the lower working classes. Now, I realize, guys, that I've been kind of waffling on a little bit there for you for the two recordings, but these are just kind of the basic things we need to know before we do delve into the text. Now, what I would like you to do, and this is just a little bit of a heads up for your driving test that will be coming up, it will be very much based on, your research around Woyzeck. So the things that I've gone through today, it would be worthwhile also researching a little bit further into this, much like what you did with Brecht. I will be sending your next lesson out soon, which will be Friday's lesson, and that will be focusing on Brecht. So it would be good to have those notes available as well. Okay, thank you very much for listening, guys. And if you've got any questions, of course, just send me an email. Thank you.